Hello, my name is Nicole Hennessy, and I am the marketing director at Comfort Keepers. And I'm so excited that you've all joined us for this webinar today. Whether you're a family caregiver or you're a Comfort Keepers caregiver, we're really happy that you've joined us today because we understand that while, being a caregiver is one of the most rewarding things that you can do, it's also not without its challenges. And we understand that caregivers are really trying to juggle so many things in your lives and are trying to find that balance. So we're so glad that you joined us today. And we have a great presenter here that's going to present a lot of really helpful information. So I am really pleased to introduce, and we're so excited that Sherri Snelling is here with us today. Sherri is a corporate gerontologist. She's the author and founder, CEO of the Caregiving Club, and her expertise is in caregiving wellness, Alzheimer's and brain health, and also aging in place wellness home design. So welcome, Sherri. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thanks, Nicole.
A couple of housekeeping things I wanted to let everybody know. During the webinar, all the participants are muted and their cameras are turned off. But if you have any questions, please just enter them in the chat. And at the end of the session, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And again, if you want to enter anything in the chat as far as what you're hoping to learn today or tips or guidance, go ahead and enter those in the chat. So we'll turn it over to you now, Sherri. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. We really appreciate it. Kind of kicking off the new year here with a little bit of focus on ourselves, which is always important. And hopefully what we're going to be able to share with you today are some really great tips for really practicing a little bit more of that self-care, which we know is so difficult and challenging to get when we're caregiving and, focusing on so many of our loved ones around us. So just as a real quick reminder, this is the second in our series of webinars that Comfort Keepers is presenting. And we'll have a couple of more coming up this year. One is going to be specifically on Alzheimer's, caregiving, and also brain health for all ages. So that's going to be a really great one. Lots of really good information. And then we're also going to talk about that well home design that Nicole just mentioned that I've really been focusing on. And it's about our environments and how our environments can help us support our wellness and also help our older loved ones who are living at home. So with that, I'm going to launch into our topic today. And, when you think about our adult lives, there are kinds of things that we plan for, maybe rites of passage, if you will. Some of us plan to get married, and typically that takes probably about 9 weeks maybe to get married. Some people may have done it a little quicker, little weekend in Vegas, or sometimes it takes longer if we have those larger weddings, but 9 weeks is about the time that we get to plan a wedding. And of course we get 9 months to plan to be parents, where we can prepare and read all the great books and buy all the things that we need to buy and get ready for that. But when it comes to caregiving, we literally have about 9 minutes to prepare to be a caregiver, particularly if it's for an older loved one. And this is because so often things are happening in a crisis. As you know, you've gotten that call that, maybe mom has fallen and she's in the ER, or if you have a spouse or a partner who's been given a devastating diagnosis, all of a sudden you're thrust into this new role, which is called caregiver. So there's a lot of different ways we go into caregiving, but unfortunately, we're just not as prepared as we are for some of the other things we do in life. And then if you're caregiving, it's also not, well, this is going to happen, and in a couple of days, everything will be fine again. I mean, those of you who are caregivers out there know this all too well. In fact, the average time that a family member spends in a caregiving role for a loved one is about 4.5 years. And that's from a study that was done by the National Alliance for Caregiving. Now, if you're caring for someone with dementia, the average length of time that you're a caregiver is 9 years, which is what you see on the screen there. So this is a marathon, not a sprint. And the reason why I talk about this is because this is why we've got to weave in to that caregiving journey our own wellness and our own needs, because it's again, it's not going to be something that's really quick and over. It's something we're going to be in for a little bit longer than maybe we anticipated. So the title of our topic today is the Caregiver Juggling Act, and the ball that's getting dropped is the ball that says me. So we want to pick that ball back up, get that back into the rotation of all the responsibilities and things that you're thinking of, and make sure that we have some balance in our lives so that we can have the energy and the stamina and, just the resiliency and emotional health that we know we all need to get through sometimes some challenges. And I want to just level set or reset maybe our thoughts around caregiving. I think as a gerontologist, one of the things that was part of my education is that, yes, I study aging, but I don't just look at the last part of life. I actually look at what we call from the womb to the tomb. So we look at everything that happens from, even before birth, and what are the choices that are being made? What are the things that are happening in your life along that life journey that will lead you to be healthier or lead you to live longer throughout your entire life? And that's kind of a little bit different than what people typically think a gerontologist does. And when I thought about this in the context of caregiving, really it's a circle. We start out and somebody is caring for us. Typically it's our parents. And then as we age and become adults, we're starting to form relationships, maybe again, starting to form those partnerships or a marriage. We may make a decision to start our families. Now we have a younger generation we're caring for. And as you start to see, there's an accumulation of caring, right? You started out with maybe caring for that spouse or partner. Now you've added maybe a child or two into the mix. Now you've got more people to care for. And then as you get into, as we know, a lot of the largest demographic group right now that's caregivers are the Gen X generation, but we know that 25% of millennials are caregiving. We know boomers are caregiving, across the lifespan, we're caring for someone. And now all of a sudden, maybe you're adding caring for an older parent or even a grandparent or other loved one. And then ultimately at the end of life, somebody's going to wind up caring for us again. So caregiving is a constant. And it's something we should maybe be planning a little bit better for. But as I said, unfortunately, that latter half of caregiving is the one that we don't focus on as much. And, 13% of the caregivers who are family members actually became first-time caregivers during the pandemic. And then the other thing that we see from a lot of studies and surveys that are out there is just the health impact of caregiving, right? I mean, you can see all those different emotions. I'm sure some of us can raise our hands and say, yes, I've absolutely felt one of these during my caregiving journey, maybe all of them, hopefully not all of them at the same time. But we do know that there's definitely an impact because a lot of this is so overwhelming, and we're trying to squeeze all this responsibility into an already, really busy life and really busy schedule. And we do know that, unfortunately, and I'm going to take you through some of the health impacts and what we can do to manage it better and think about it differently, is that we are opening ourselves up to obviously more stress. When we have more stress, we have higher inflammation in our bodies. We know inflammation is that's the bad word that leads to all of the different chronic illnesses or things like diabetes, even things like headaches and other ailments that we may have. But also we are lessening our immune system, the antibodies in our system. We're not able to fight those colds and those viruses as well. And we also see higher rates of depression and anxiety. And in fact, during the pandemic, depression levels, you guys, I'm sure saw it in all the news headlines, it actually doubled. And for family caregivers, it was exacerbated even more because we kind of went into some of our caregiving roles with a little bit of that, maybe low-grade depression. And in fact, emotional health was kind of the biggest impact that one of the studies found. It was actually done by Embracing Carers. And they looked across the globe during the pandemic at family caregivers and said, what's going on? And they found emotional health was definitely impacted. And in fact, burnout was higher among our younger generation of caregivers. And we also know from other studies that those of you who caregiving is actually your profession, it's the job that you do. We know that burnout is also something that is, definitely a challenge for those of you who are in the role of professional caregivers. And, I just want to acknowledge too, that as much as we talk about family caregivers, we forget that there are people who are in these jobs That's your quote unquote day job, but you may also go home and be a family caregiver as well. So there's a lot of extra burdens sometimes on our healthcare workers and people who are in the profession of caregiving. So going back to what we're going to focus on today, again, as a gerontologist, there's something that we use that's a framework for how we look at everything, and particularly around wellness and health. And it's called the biopsychosocial framework. And what this means is my education is in biology, psychology, and sociology, but it's not about those three separate areas. It's about how those areas impact each other. And one of the things that we know is when one of these little circles is out of balance in our lives, then we aren't optimally well. We don't have as much wellness as we possibly could if we could bring that back into balance. So, there's a lot of people out there that do a really good job maybe at, physical exercise and nutrition, and they feel then, okay, I've got it handled, I'm healthy. But if you don't have psychological health and if you don't have social health, then you aren't going to be as healthy and well, and ultimately you won't live as long unless you have that balance. So that's really what we're going to focus on today. And I'm going to just break this down for you because I actually have a program that I do, and it's called the Me Time Monday program. And so what I did is I took those three areas of biopsychosocial, I broke them down into 7 different areas of our lives. And these are kind of the main areas that really impact our wellness. And I'm going to take you through each one of these 7 areas and talk a little bit about what they mean and how we might be able to get a little bit more wellness in an area that you might feel like you're not doing as well in, or you need some help with. And then the Me Time Monday program, and I'll talk about that more at the end of this, but that's really about how do I do it? Because it's like, okay, this is all great information, but I always, whenever I talk to people, they're like, yeah, that's great. How do I do it? So that the Me Time Monday is the how do you do it? And it's about how do you take these little, maybe like 5-minute little exercises. Cause I am not a big, like, you got to go out and, work out all weekend or do these things for hours on end. Little 5-minute increments that we can add to our day that stack up. And we're going to talk about how that accumulates to give us better wellness over time. So let's start first with biology. And I want to make this really interactive. And I think Nicole said, if you've got questions, please put them into the chat. She's going to moderate that for us. And we'll definitely answer all the questions at the end. But if something is relevant as we're going through this, maybe we'll weave that in. But I want to start with biology, and I want to start with a little test. I'm going to give you guys 3 little tests in biology, psychology, and sociology. And they're not tough. But here's our first test. So as you're listening to me right now, I want you to just think about, as you're sitting there, is your tongue pressed against the roof of your mouth? Now, you're not trying to do it, but is it just automatically pressed against the roof of your mouth? The other little test is, have you noticed over maybe the last few weeks or even months that you feel like you got a phone call, or you thought you heard your phone vibrate? Maybe it's in your pocket or on your desk or, in your purse or wherever, but, and you thought maybe you got a little tweet or chime or text or whatever it is, and you check your phone and there's nothing there. And you think, that's weird. And then it happens maybe again later on. So you've had several of these. So that's a sign of anxiety. And the tongue test is a sign of stress. And one of the things that's really kind of almost insidious about stress is that it is invisible. It's not like you have a rash or you have a wound and you have a cast on your arm and everybody says, oh my gosh, what did you do? How are you doing? Stress is something that we don't often see, and people don't often see what is happening to us from that stress. It's all happening inside to kind of wreak its havoc on our physical and our emotional systems. But I just wanted to let you know that these are signs that you do have stress in your life, and you may not even have noticed it. So these are really interesting tests that we give to show people that how invisible stress can be. Now let's talk a little bit about the impact. So some of you might be familiar with the word telomere. It's actually based on some research that was done by Elizabeth Blackburn over the last 20 years. And she wrote a great book called The Telomere Effect. And what she found is, our DNA, which are the chromosomes that we all have that make us all unique, on the end of the strands of our DNA, are something called telomeres. And if you think about those telomeres as the little plastic ends on the end of like a shoelace, well, they are the ends of our DNA strands that actually keep the DNA strands intact. Okay, so they make that DNA strand healthy. They don't let anything escape or unravel. But here's what happens when we have chronic stress. So when you have ongoing stress that you're not able to manage through other, exercises or techniques, what's happening is the telomeres are dissolving. So those little protective caps, they're starting to go away. And then as you can see with the shoelace, all of a sudden the DNA strand starts to unravel. And you're thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, what Dr. Blackburn told us is that 1 year of chronic stress is actually taking 6 years off your life, because as that DNA strand unravels, that's really going to contribute to how long you will live. And so now I don't want to stress you out further by telling you about this, because the good news is you can build it back. And the way that you build it back is by embracing some of these things that we talk about in wellness that help, manage that stress and keep it down. It's actually called telomerase. I'm not going to get into the science of it, but just, finding ways that you can practice to not have that stress be chronic so that it's ongoing is really critical. And so the next test is in psychology. And by the way, I have the crayons up there, and you probably noticed when you saw the 7 elements of wellness, they were all in color. Part of the program that I'm not going to talk a little in much depth today, but there is color psychology, and there's a lot of research being done by this. And actually, one of the prominent researchers, Bevel Conway, who is with MIT, and he also does a lot of research for the National Eye Institute. He is really studying how colors are perceived by our brains and then actually have impact on our emotions. We also know that within, for instance, like home design, certain colors are actually better for certain, if you want to be calmed and soothed. There's also certain colors that as our eyes age, we see better. So color psychology is a really big area of study right now, and it's very interesting to me, but it's also about bringing color back into our lives. So I wanted to use that in that Me Time Monday graphic. So here's our test on psychology. We all talk about how we don't feel as resilient. There's a lot of surveys out there saying people are really lacking in resiliency. And so the questions I have for you are, do you kind of feel a lack of control over things in your life? Not people per se, but just control over things that you feel you should have control over. Do you feel more hopeful or more hopeless right now? Are you fearful of the future? We see these headlines in the news all the time. And so financially or health-wise, do you have concerns about the future for either yourself or your loved ones? And then finally, are you feeling a little unmotivated and kind of find yourself wasting time on just random activities that don't really have much meaning for you and also don't really do much for you? So these are all of the questions that I would just ask you to think about. And what these are relating to is actually 2 different areas of our emotional health. So the one side is what we call now languishing. And there's a lot of discussion right now in psychology about this kind of concept of languishing. And it also relates to something that psychologists are talking about, which is called the cave syndrome. So the cave syndrome is where you retreat within and you almost become inert, where you're not really moving or doing much because you're just not sure what's going to happen. So you're just kind of there. And that's a little bit of what languishing is as well. And so, listen, we all tend to have those moments where maybe you want to binge watch, a new series off of Netflix or something, and you spend a couple of days in bed and then you think, oh my goodness, what did I do? When you're a caregiver, that's probably not happening because you don't have time to watch any of those types of series. But if you do find yourself doing things that are a little bit mindless, like scrolling through social media or, just looking up, different things on the internet at night or doing things that you don't even really know why you're doing them, this is part of what we call languishing. And part of this is a little bit of denial. We know that denial is one of the 5 stages of grief. And it's our way of saying, you know what, there's just so much going on in my life and so much going on out there. I just can't deal. So I'm just going to kind of escape and check out here. And so that's a concern, because while we all need those moments of, getting away from things, and I'll talk about that in a minute, we also don't want that to overtake our lives. Now, the other side of anxiety is also around where it's more acute, and it's really starting to impact your ability to, again, kind of feel like you're engaged in life, and you have a lot of anticipatory fear. You're concerned about every potential thing that could happen in the future, and whether that has to deal with the person that you're caring for, or something at work, or whatever it happens to be. You're kind of in this constant state of anxiety, and all of these are stress responses. Now, the stress response is fight or flight, right? We know that that's a survival mechanism. It's actually good. It's part of the ancient brain. It's the thing that helps us survive, because we know when there's a threat, you've got to either fight or you've got to flee. And but those are short bursts of energy, and it's where what happens in the brain is the brain says to all other parts of your body, okay, we're going to slow everything down, because I've got to get the energy to the muscles, because we're physically going to have to move here very quickly. When you're in that constant state, however, you're really impacting then the ability for all these other things to get that balance back of what they need to be able to function properly. So that's a little bit about chronic stress. When it's around anxiety, what we talk about is something called post-traumatic growth. Now, this is different from post-traumatic stress disorder, which we hear a lot about within our military and veteran communities. But post-traumatic growth is actually now a psychology framework for taking people who have high anxiety and getting them to reconnect. And so both of these things, whether it's languishing or whether it's high anxiety, are about reconnecting with the meaning in your life, with things that you can find positivity with, which you can be passionate about and purposeful. And sometimes when we're so focused on other people, like, our loved ones, we just start to forget about all of those things that we need. And this is why this is a big part of the psychology part of our wellness. And then the final test is around sociology. And we know, there's a great study that's still ongoing at Harvard University, if you can believe it. It started back in 1937. It's the longest, what we call longitudinal studies, which are normally studies that are done over maybe many months or even maybe, several years. Well, this is the longest one that's been going on. And what they've been looking at is what does make people live longer. And so they've looked at all different socioeconomic groups, different cultural groups, racial groups, all kinds of things. And they're trying to find what are the secrets to living longer. And what they've come up with after about 80 years or so of research, there is one secret that they found. And that is that people who have quality relationships and at least one confidant in their life will live longer. Now, this is outside of all the other good things that we can do, like, don't smoke, don't drink too much, again, good nutrition, good physical, exercise, get moving. The probably the best thing you can possibly do in your life is have those quality relationships. And it's something we talk about in what we call the linked lives theory. So my test for you is this, obviously, we all had to isolate during the pandemic. And I think that was really challenging and very overwhelming for a lot of us, particularly those of us who were caregiving for a loved one or who have caregiving as a profession, and all the safety protocols and different issues that we were having to struggle with. And so there's a difference, though, between social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation is actually the physical being isolated from somebody or being unable to be as social as maybe you want to be. And so, for instance, if somebody is in a wheelchair and they're less ambulatory and they don't get out as much and they don't have as much help staying social and getting outside and integrating into different social activities, then you can be in that state of social isolation. Loneliness, however, relates to how we feel really about the quality of our relationships. And loneliness, you can be at work surrounded by people, you could be at a party, you could be in a marriage or a partnership or out with friends, and you can still feel lonely. And it's because we're thinking more about the quality of the relationships isn't giving us what we need. And so these are really important distinctions. And one of the things that we know is that loneliness actually is more tied to our health impacts. And we know that, as you see on the screen there, over 8 million adults in the US who are over age 50 report themselves as being chronically lonely. Now, this is an age where we see a lot of people also be taking on caregiving for older parents or grandparents. We know that caregivers in a lot of surveys and studies have said, I feel really lonely. And again, sometimes we're picking that up from the loved one we're caring for. If they feel lonely and isolated, we might start to almost feel that way ourselves. So that's something we have to be aware of. And then certainly it increases our risk for a lot of things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but also for Alzheimer's disease. It's one of the things that's now linked to Alzheimer's. And so speaking of Alzheimer's, I do a lot of work in the dementia community, and I do a lot of my study went into psychology, but also neuroscience. And so I wanted to share this slide with you because, first of all, to me, it looks like angel hair pasta. I don't know about you guys, but when I was working with a researcher at a medical center out here in California, and he's one of the top researchers in Alzheimer's worldwide, he does a lot of work in vascular dementia. And so this is actually the MRI of a brain. And what this is showing us is that inside of each one of our brains are 400 miles of blood vessels, which always blows my mind when I think about it. Like, you think about that superhighway being up there in your brain. But what his research is showing is that about 50% of dementias actually start because we have hypertension, we have high blood pressure that we're not managing. And what this does is this puts so much pressure on these teeny weeny little blood vessels in our brain that they're starting to, again, almost like the telomeres, they're starting to dissolve a little bit or get, if you will, potholes in the highway. And what this then happens is there's toxins that are released into the brain. And this is what they're thinking might be forming or creating some of the tau tangles or the beta amyloid, which are two things that they look for in Alzheimer's disease. And so what he's saying, and now what the Alzheimer's Association is very much behind, because they've done more than just his research, they've replicated this research worldwide, is that managing our blood pressure is really going to help us with preventing things like Alzheimer's disease. And when you're lonely, we know that our blood pressure goes up. When we're stressed, we know our blood pressure goes up. When we have depression and anxiety, our blood pressure goes up. So we have to really recognize how all of these things play together in terms of our overall wellness and overall health. So now that I've given you all the bad news, let's get into the good news, right? Let's go somewhere good. So I love this picture because it always does make me feel a little bit calmer. I wish I was on this pier right now, maybe with a glass of wine. But anyway, this is how we're going to find some calm in the chaos. So as I go back to these 7 elements of caregiving, or caregiver wellness, this is kind of the edit that we're going to do. This is how we're going to look at our lives, hopefully from now on. And as I said, I've taken that biopsychosocial and I've blown that out to these 7 different areas. So let's go through these right now. So let's start with physical. And no, I'm not going to talk to you about nutrition and exercise. Those are good. And those are for another day. But something else that is in the news headlines, and probably a lot of you have been thinking about, and a lot of you maybe have been reading a lot about sleep, right? We're all told you need to get good sleep. You need to at least get 7 to 8 hours of good sleep a night. Well, it's interesting because when I've done this talk in the past, I've had people come up to me afterwards and they've said, oh my gosh, I'm really blown away by what you told me, because I've been getting like 5.5 hours of sleep, and I'm fine with it. Like, I don't feel it at all. But now I recognize that maybe I'm not realizing what's going on. So let me tell you a little bit about sleep and what's happening with your brain. So we know that, I call it the night shift, because when we get good sleep, this is giving our body the ability to kind of shut down, and really everything's controlled by the brain, right? The brain is the motor for everything. And so what the brain does is it goes to work when we go to sleep. And so when we're not needing to think about decision making or facing challenges, when our breathing can become slower, when we're not needing to send energy to our muscles to even walk up or down stairs or to or from our cars or whatever it is, that's when the brain can then say, let me focus on cleaning all of this stuff up that just happened during the day. And so it's clearing out the toxins in your brain. And what it is we need you to get the 7-8 hours. And here's why. Because you need to get into those REM, those rapid eye movement cycles, and you need 4 cycles a night. Now they happen about every hour and a half to 2 hours. Aha, that's where the 7 to 8 hours comes from, because think about it like a dishwasher or a laundry. If you're needing to do at least, okay, I've got to clean these dishes 4 times for them to get really, really clean, or the laundry to get really, really clean. If you only do it once, then it's kind of clean, but not, there's still some smudges and stuff left on it. Well, this is what's happening in your body. And that's what your brain's trying to do. They're trying to get through the 4 cycles during the night to clean your brain out. And what it means is we're managing all the emotions and all the things that happen during the day. And so, that old saying that probably most of our moms said, like, just sleep on it. Like, if you have a problem, just sleep on it, deal with it tomorrow. That's actually neuroscience. We didn't know that our moms were neuroscientists, but it really is true, because what's happening is during the night, the brain is starting to modulate as well the emotions that you had. So something that you were just so angry about, and maybe if you're a caregiver, you're thinking, I just can't do this anymore. What happens with good sleep is your brain is starting to manage that a little bit better, give you the kind of energy that you're going to need. So when you wake up the next morning, you're like, okay, you know what? All right. Okay. I can do this. I can do this. But you didn't feel that the day before. So this is one of the reasons why sleep is so important. Now, the other thing is, if you have wakenings during the night, you're going to disrupt that circadian rhythm and those REM cycles. So that's not good. We want you to stay in sleep and not be able to get up. And one of the things that wakes us up or doesn't let us get to sleep and give us enough hours are blue light emissions. So everything in our lives is based on blue light because of our technology. So we've got the lights on our nightstand, we've got televisions, we've got, iPads or phones that we're looking at and scrolling through, or whatever we're doing. We need to eliminate as many of those things as possible. And we were telling a story before we started this, and I said, I've really embraced this concept of putting the amber and red night lights around my bathroom and bedroom, because I do get up at night and need to use the restroom. And when you turn on the light, what happens, that blue light tells your body and your brain, wake up, it's daytime. And so what we want to do is we want to stay in more of that nighttime. So you need light so you don't trip over things. The red and amber lights don't tell your brain to wake up. So something you may want to try. That's one of my little hacks. But even if you're adding 5 minutes more of sleep a night, and you accumulate that, and maybe after a few weeks, you add 10 more minutes, maybe 15 more minutes, it's actually going to help out your health. So let's talk about the environment. As I mentioned, really into our home environments where we're all spending or have spent so much of our time, but let's talk just about being in the environment in general. So we know that there's things that they're now calling nature deficit disorder because we don't get outside enough. I mean, because of the technology where, even travel, people weren't able to travel through the pandemic. And so they were taking trips to Paris, but it was all virtual, and it was done through either virtual reality or just online or whatever. But it's really important that we do get outside. And, Dr. Andrew Weil, who's one of my favorite, researchers, and he wrote a book called Spontaneous Happiness. He talks about this a lot. And he says, in generations past, we had more resiliency and we had less anxiety. And part of it was because we were outside more and we were socializing with our neighbors. Maybe we were out on the front porch, or the kids were playing in the street or the park or whatever. And we don't do as much of that these days. And so getting back out in nature becomes really important. And it's also, again, it's tied to brain health in the way that when we're outside, we tend to use more of the 5 senses. So we're looking at things, we're smelling things, we're hearing different, the birds in the trees. Maybe we're going and we're touching different things that are outside. But when you use those 5 senses in your life, that actually is, again, that's almost like exercising your brain. And that's what we want you to do. Now, the other thing is, just from a psychological standpoint, being outside is a journey, right? Even if it's a 5-minute trip around the neighborhood, it's a journey. you learn new things, being outside and kind of taking these little small trips, it's opening you up to possibilities. It's giving you the sense of, hey, I can go do something. And then when it comes to the wellness home design, this is what we call now biofeeling design. It's where we bring nature in. So I won't get into the detail because I'm doing a lot of writing about this, and one of my next books is on this, but it's all about how do we bring that nature inside. And even if it's just looking out at I'm looking out at my window right now at a tree, even if you're looking at through a window and you're seeing beautiful flowers or trees, or you bring some of those things inside, is really what can help us in terms of brain health. And then there's something that's been picking up, I don't know about in your area. I know out here in California, it's become very big. Californians they're very big about being outside typically, but it's called forest bathing. I just did a forest bathing tour with an expert. It was really phenomenal, but it's actually, again, where you're outside and you're really being guided through just taking in nature and really thinking about nature. So these are all ways that we can take these little tiny escapes during the day and help out the environment that we're in. Now, when it comes to, being more social, I think the daily digital detox is something we talk a lot about. And one of the things I mentioned is that technology is something that is in our lives and it's here to stay. But the reality is our bodies are 100 years behind the technology we now use. Think about that. It was just a little over 100 years ago that Edison, invented electricity and the light bulb and all these other things now that run off electricity and all the digital stuff that has to be plugged in that we use. So it's only been 100 years. Normally for our bodies to be able to adapt to, new stuff that we're surrounded in, it takes thousands of years. So we've only had 100 years to try to get used to all of this stuff. And clearly our bodies are like going, okay, overload. So, when we have constant alerts and you're getting constant texts and, you're needing to keep up on things or respond or whatever, this is initiating that stress response in our life. It's keeping us on high alert at all times. Now, when you're caregiving, it's really tough, right? To disconnect from that because you have to be on alert. There might be a crisis, there might be an emergency. You have to be there for your loved one. So it's really tough. But even if you can take 10 minutes, 20 minutes a day and unplug for yourself, and maybe you do this right before bed. Maybe this is a good new bedtime routine. 20 minutes before you go to official sleep, unplug everything and just kind of lie there and think about the day. Or maybe it's during the day. Maybe you're in a really stressful moment and you say, I just need to escape. Unplug for a while and just give yourself those moments of calmness and quiet. Think about something else. We like to practice gratitude, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But, one of the studies that came out showed us that a lot of people are on social media. And in fact, if you can believe this, we spend more time on social media than we do sleeping. Okay, clearly we're backwards on that. We need to fix that because social media actually can increase our depression. Part of it is because, everybody's on social media saying, hey, look at how great this is and how great my child is doing and this and that. And if things aren't going so well in your life, now all of a sudden you feel like wow, look at my life. My life isn't going that great. So it can actually drag you down. So we have to be a little bit, careful about that social media. You have to be careful about news headlines because let me tell you, I'm a journalist and I've been in the news business, and it's all about, unfortunately, the crisis of the day, right? And so a lot of the news headlines are not positive. They're not talking about all the positive stuff out there. They're talking about all the bad stuff out there. And so when you get a daily dose and constant input of this, it can really drag you down, and it actually increases our rates of depression. So in Denmark, they have something called hygge, and it's spelled Hygge. You've probably seen this in a lot of articles, maybe, or seen some of the books that have been out there. But hygge is actually translated as coziness. And in Denmark, the way they practice hygge is, again, they digital detox. They pull away from all the electronics. They cozy up next to a fire, put the socks on, get the coffee or the cocoa going, maybe sit down with a book or an old-fashioned board game. They can do it either on their own or socially, but it's about getting back to just basics without all this electronic digital world in our life. So that's something that if you can infuse a little bit of that hygge into your week, I think it will really help. Now, the next one is the emotional side. And, there's kind of, this is a little controversial, by the way, in the scientific community, but it was a study that came out a few years ago. Now it's been in about 15 years, I think. Anyway, what the study showed is that there's a U curve to happiness. And here's what it essentially said. At about the age of, 18, 25, whatever, we are really happy because we don't have a whole lot of maybe responsibility in our life. We're young. The world is our oyster. We're all looking ahead, and it's usually a pretty good time for many people. But as we start to get into our lives, then we start to add things. And that's why I was saying we start to accumulate, right? We accumulate maybe a partner or a spouse. We accumulate a career. We accumulate children. We accumulate a mortgage, car payments, insurance, yada, yada, yada. All of this stuff starts adding up. And so when we hit midlife, and this is the classic midlife crisis, all of a sudden we're feeling like, I'm overwhelmed by all these responsibilities. And then we have something like the pandemic, or maybe I've become a caregiver for a parent or grandparent. And again, we're just at that, oh my gosh, I can't take it anymore. This is what they're finding is in that era of late 40s and, kind of early 50s is when we're at our lowest point for happiness. But then the good news is you start to go back up the happiness curve. And what's fascinating to me is that they found that people are at their most happy after about the age of 65 and even into their 70s and 80s. Now, you would think the opposite, because this is the age when, let's face it, we're starting to face maybe chronic illness. The body's not working as good as it used to. Maybe the hearing's going a little bit, the hair's getting a little thinner. The body's certainly not looking like it used to, unless you're, I guess, Jane Fonda or somebody. But you wouldn't think that maybe that would be the happiest point. But the fact of the matter is that what's happened is when we get older, we are wiser. I hate to say that. I know some of you who might be younger are thinking, well, I'm pretty wise. Well, you really gain in wisdom as you go through life, but it's about surviving. It's about, you've been through the challenges. You've managed to survive it. You've managed to get past some of the humps in life. And also you're really grateful and looking for that quality and really looking at those relationships that I was talking about and making sure that you're spending quality time. And then part of it is we know our time horizons are shorter. We don't have as much life left, so we want to make the most out of it. So the interesting thing is that if you're feeling yourself in that middle section right now, the good news is that there is going to be an uptick in the happiness factor. But one of the ways that as caregivers, I think we can be happy is to let go gracefully of guilt and grief. Now, these are two emotions that we know are very heavily tied with caregiving. I feel very guilty that we're just not doing enough for either the loved one we're caring for, or for our kids, or for our relationship, or for, work, whatever it is, we're feeling guilt. We're just not doing enough for everybody. And maybe we even feel guilty that we're not getting enough me time. So guilt is kind of one of these emotions that's really tied to caregiving. I think that guilt is actually probably not the right word. We use it a lot, but actually it's more about kind of regrets. Guilt is actually when you've purposely hurt somebody. And so if we want to really parse the word, it's not really about guilt. It's really about being regretful that you aren't able to do maybe as much as you want. And then certainly grief. And as I said, the 5 stages of grief, we start with denial, and then we go to anger, then we go to bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. And now there's a new book by the colleague of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about those 5 stages of grief. So David Kessler, her colleague, writes now about the 6th stage, which is meaning. And it's about coming out of acceptance into having a more meaningful life. But I think that if we can find ways to let go of these feelings and give ourselves that grace of, I'm doing the best I can. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. I'm trying to help. May not be perfect every day. I may not be able to do 100% of what I'd like to do for everybody, but at least I'm in the game. And also when it comes to grief, look at some of the bright side, look at some of the gifts that you're getting maybe from caregiving rather than all of the, the grieving and the challenges. And there's got to be something, there's got to be a silver lining in something. So there are practices for this. And part of it is being grateful. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, there's the step in financial wellness is a big one. We know that caregivers are often really taxed with being engaged in the finances of their loved one. And that's either as a coordinator, you're helping maybe to pay bills or look over things like long-term care insurance plans and what those benefits look like and how they're going to help, but also maybe contributing financially. And this is where we get into a lot of out-of-pocket costs that we didn't even realize might be happening. And so again, as a family, it's really important to know if you feel like you're going to become a caregiver for a loved one, what does the financial picture look like? Are you going to be impacted, or do you feel that the person who's needing the care has enough savings and has enough of these right plans in place so that you're not going to feel that financial crunch yourself? And we know that financial wellness is now a big theme at a lot of employers are giving their employees financial wellness tips and resources and other things to help them out. But again, that sandwich generation is really squeezed because you're both caring for your younger generation that might still need help because of the job market or what's going on with the pandemic, as well as our older loved ones. And so these are some of the costs. I think it's really important, if you are in caregiving and you're not aware of this, or if you think you might be a caregiver, it's really important to just know what are the basics. And the basics are really going to be around, where is my loved one going to live? And then how are they going to be cared for? And the two obvious big choices there are, well, there are senior living communities, but then more people now are turning to home care because of what happened during the pandemic. The feeling of having more control goes back to that anxiety, right? We want more control over our environments and our loved ones. And the best way to do that is to have our loved ones at home. And then we have to decide, okay, am I going to need that extra help? And again, that's where somebody like Comfort Keepers can come in, because I'm going to need a partnership. And I know that I can't maybe rely on my siblings because they're just not going to be there, or they live long distance, but I can't also do it all by myself. So I've got to have a partnership in this. And then what are those costs going to look like? And how do we plan ahead for that and manage that? So I think the whole conversation around costs and finances are critical. And it's just something we tend not to get into until there's a crisis. Now, the next stage is intellectual. Now, this is not about your IQ, by the way. This is actually more about our emotional IQ. And, we talk about emotional intelligence as being empathetic, but there's also a side to pushing ourselves a little bit. And there's something called flow theory. Now, what the researcher, and by the way, when I do this in person, I have my book that I wrote, and I always give that out to the person who can actually pronounce the researcher's name correctly. So, but since we're on a Zoom call, I'll just tell you that the way that you pronounce his name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he is I think he's Hungarian or Czechoslovakian, I can't remember, but he's the researcher who came up with flow theory. And what he said is, again, going back to that languishing, when we're not pushing ourselves, we're really not happy. Now, you can get pushed too far and then you're really not happy. But what he was saying is, we need to find something for ourselves that engages us, that we enjoy, that we want to do, but that we have to put a little effort in. It's not going to be just, easy street. And so whether that's something like you want to learn how to, crochet, or you want to learn a new language, or whatever it is, he's saying find ways to find that flow, because that flow is going to give you that anchor that you need to not feel like you're languishing, to help you with resiliency, because it's something you can control. It's something you want to do, and it will bring you back to that feeling of accomplishment. Because so often, I think when we're caregivers, we don't have control over disease. We cannot control cancer, Alzheimer's, or heart disease, right? We don't have control really over our loved ones. I mean, they're going to make decisions and maybe we're not going to be super happy with them, but this is where we have to have the conversation. We have to say, okay, you know what? That's great, but this is how it's going to impact me. But often we don't do that. We just hold that back. And so when we don't feel we have that control, then we feel adrift. And that's where we have the anxiety. Flow theory is going to help you get that back. So think about something you've been thinking in your life that you want to learn to do or want to do. What would it be, and what could it be so it's really small? It's not something you have to spend a whole lot of time at or whatever during the day. And then we have the spiritual side of wellness, which is really important. And this is where I mentioned gratitude. So, we talk a lot about gratitude in our culture and in society, but I wonder how many of us actually really practice it. And one of the things that we know about gratitude is that it is our social glue. It's the thing that kind of brings us together as a society. It brings us together with friends, with family members, when we really focus on the good and we really try to push away some of the negativity that is just out there everywhere in our world. And so it rescues you a little bit from those toxic feelings. So if you can think about, maybe one of the ways to do this is, we were talking about digital detox for sleeping. So maybe you turn all of the blue light emission off, you get into bed, you're comfy and you're cozy, and you just spend a few minutes thinking about, okay, so what am I grateful about today? What happened today, or who are the people in my life today that I actually am grateful for? Because it's really more about people and not so much things. Very few people probably say, I'm so grateful for that red Ferrari in my garage. That might make you feel good for 5 minutes. Or, maybe you got a real, high when you rode it the first time, but over time, it's not going to make you happy. But being grateful for people is going to actually kind of bring you out of some of those feelings of being down and, nobody really cares about you or whatever, because we can find it. So I think that practicing some gratitude, and whether you do it the first thing when you wake up, or you do it when you go to bed at night, or whatever it is, find every day just to tell yourself one line of gratitude. And so really quickly, because I know we're probably running out of time and I want to make sure we have time for any of your questions. The Me Time Monday program, so I'll tell you just quickly what it's about. So me time, of course, is where we focus on ourselves, right? So if you take those 7 different elements that we just walked through, what are the things that are going to bring you joy? Because I don't want it to be work. It's not like, well, I have to work out today. No. That's not me time. That's maybe something you should do, but it's not me time. Me time is where you do something fun. You do something that kind of connects you almost with, that carefree childhood that we have. So, when I do the workshop, I always ask people, well, what did you like to do when you were a kid? And then people laugh and it's like, well, I can't do that now. Well, why not? Of course you can. So we think about what nourishes our soul, what brings us that moment of joy, that moment of happiness, that smile on our face that we all need to keep going. And can we practice that so that it's not just, once every 6 months, I think about, some me time, but can I do something every week, and can I make it small? And, that's the whole concept of the Mondays and stuff, is that we want to give you a prompt so that it's not every 6 months, but it's every week. You think about, okay, what am I going to do maybe for myself this week? And so this Monday concept in science is that it was done actually by Johns Hopkins. And they worked out some surveys that showed that when people embrace healthier behaviors or wellness programs, they actually are more successful if they start things on a Monday, and then every Monday they check in with themselves. And Monday seemed to be the day of the week that was better than any other week. And I think, part of it is our cultural DNA. We're used to starting the work week and the school week on a Monday. And so it's kind of the start of things, right? So, I always encourage people to use Monday, not necessarily as the day you're going to do your me time thing, but maybe that's the day you plan it and you say, okay, what does the week look like today? Oh, Tuesday looks ugly, and Wednesday I have to be with my mom or my dad all day doing, this stuff. Maybe Thursday, maybe Friday, or whatever it is, but just use Monday as that reset point, and then reward yourself, because every Monday you should be giving yourself little kudos. And whether it's something silly, like you go, yeah, I rock today, which is something simple we can all do, or whether you actually give yourself a little treat, like my dog, she gets her little treats, but if we give ourselves like something that we've been looking forward to, and we deserve that little reward, it actually will accumulate if you keep doing this. We have about 52 Mondays in the calendar year. And so if we can find these me time moments and give ourselves kudos, it brings us outside of all of the other challenges, I think, and obstacles that we have in life. And so again, baby steps. This is part of the behavioral science of people like BJ Fogg, who does a lot of research at Stanford. And there's something called habit stacking that was by James Clear. He wrote a book about this, but it's all about make it small. I'm not saying go out and ride your exercise bike for 30 minutes. No. Just take a walk around the block. Take 5 minutes, go outside, breathe in nature, look at nature, whatever it is, or listen to your favorite song. Shut down at lunchtime and say, you know what? I'm going to listen to some of my favorite tunes or whatever it is that feeds yourself, but baby steps, teeny tiny. And the habit stacking is something, again, I take you through exercises and stuff, but what you can do is you can say, okay, in the morning, when I get up, I'm going to say a line of gratitude, or maybe my trigger or my prompt will be as I'm brushing my teeth, because we want to make it automatic, right? We want to make these little habits automatic. So as I'm brushing my teeth, I'm going to say a line of gratitude. What am I grateful for today? Or, maybe I go over to the wall. BJ Fogg said he does this. He brushes his teeth. I think that's what he said, or maybe he said he goes to the bathroom, one or the other, and he goes over to the wall and he does 5 wall push-ups. And then he accumulated and added on more push-ups. He's now up to 50 wall push-ups a day. Pretty good. But we make it automatic. So it's something we don't think about. And this is really important for brain science, again, because anything we can do that brings us wellness that we don't have to make a choice about, it's just an automated, okay, I brush my teeth, so now I have to do this, is going to make it easier, because it frees your mind up and your brain to focus on those other big decisions that you have to make during the day. You don't want your wellness to have to be a choice. You want it to be a habit. So with that, I just want to say thank you for being a great audience and listening. I hope that you've been able to get some things out of this. Think about your daily routines, your weekly routines. How can we help you have that wellness and that balance and focus on you? Because when you become a caregiver, you're caring for 2 lives, the person that you're caring for, but also for yourself. And so with that, I want to say Happy New Year to all of you. Here are some resources that can help you out. And and I also have my reading list for you and a couple of videos that are really, really great that I didn't mention, but you should check these out because they're just so poignant and so wonderful. And they relate to what I was talking about in terms of look up is about social media. It's about what we miss when we're looking down at our smartphones. We're missing a lot of life. And this video, by the way, will make you cry. So get some Kleenex. And then drawings for my grandchildren is just wonderful. It actually won the jury prize at Harvard's Unlonely Project Film Festival, but it's all about when we get older and we don't feel like we have that meaning and purpose in our lives, how can we reconnect? And drawings for my grandchildren is wonderful. You'll just love it. And it's a great one to share with the kids as well. So with that, and then my podcast you can listen to because I interview lots of really cool people. So if you want to check that out, but thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Nicole to see if we had any questions from the audience.
Okay. Sherri, one participant just asked if you could go back to the reading list for a minute. I think
Sure.
you wanted to take another look at that.
Yeah, I mentioned, so I mentioned the telomere effect. If you're really interested in what stress does to your body, great book. Happy is the New Healthy has a lot of really great stuff in it. And I actually just interviewed that author, Joan Nihal, last week on the podcast. Why We Sleep is a wonderful book about sleep science. And then there's a Huga book for you.
Well, thank you so much, Sherri. One person did chime in. This wasn't so much about balance, but, how can you get family members, more involved in care? This person had a sister that lives, closer to their mother, but, isn't that helpful? So
yeah.
If
Well,
you have
I
any
think,
quick tips on that?
I do. I mean, so something, there's something that we do. It's an exercise called the social convoy model. And what it is basically it's little circles. So you are the main circle in the middle, and then you draw a circle around that. And you say, okay, who really has my back? Who can be there in emergency that I can call that can help me out with caregiving or, pick up my kids or do whatever, but I can call them for pretty much anything. So you put that in the next circle. Then you do a circle around that and you say, okay, who are occasional helpers, for things that I'm going to need? And again, now that caregiving has changed my life, this is what I'm now seeing that I need help with. And so who's that outside circle? And the reason why it's so important to visualize that is because sometimes I think we have unrealistic expectations. And I say that only because, listen, family dynamics are tough, right? And we all have that bossy older sister or brother, or, maybe the younger sister or brother that's kind of flaky, or somebody that lives long distance and doesn't really, help out a lot. We just have to be realistic because people aren't going to change. And so, when you're thinking about your siblings, think about what are they really capable of that you know them better than anybody. And then how do you make that work for you? Sometimes what I found is that caregivers figure out that they have a sibling who absolutely does not want to get involved in the physical help and caring of mom, but maybe they'll pay for some respite care for you. And we know Comfort Keepers provides respite care, so you can get a break. Wouldn't that be great? Or maybe they're just going to be there so that you can vent. You can say, guess what happened today? So whatever it is, assign them a role that they can manage, and that won't set you up for feeling like they're not doing what I expect them to do. But sometimes our expectations can be a little unrealistic when it comes to our family members.
We just had one more question on the same kind of thread, and someone was asking what can they do if, when it comes down to it, there's really, no one in that circle that you can really count on.
Well, I would say, again, if you're feeling very isolated or lonely in your caregiving journey, then at the very least, you need to get some, if you can financially manage it, get some help from professional caregivers, because you have to get a break. Two, it's nice to feel like you have a team. Sometimes when we do things as a solo act, it's not as rewarding, even unless we have somebody else that we can kind of share things with. So get somebody else engaged. And usually it is more of a professional caregiver. And then they, as we know, they often become part of your family. So, at the very least, you have to have somebody who's part of your team.
Okay, thank you. Well, I did want to mention too, because I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the webinar, is that we did record this as well. So if there's anybody that you want to share it with, we will have it up on Comfort Keepers website by Monday, for sure. By Monday morning, it'll be up on our website. So you could go there and view it again or share it with others that might be helpful. But again, thank you so much for participating and attending, and we hope that you will join us again on our next webinar for caregivers.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Great to see you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.